Jeremy Hammond is one of my favorite people. Jeremy is a journalist. What would you say your expertise really is in foreign policy? I mean, that's kind of where
my self-education in terms of journalism, yeah. I mean, that's where I got started writing. My education, background-wise, is I have a degree in communications, film and video, which I never used. But I got started writing, just about foreign policy after 9/11, and just became curious about, why, when that happened, and George Bush was like, well, they hate our freedom, and that was his explanation for the events. I didn't buy that, and so I just started researching. I was sincerely curious and wanted to understand that. So that was kind of began my path, my journey down that, in terms of researching foreign policy. That eventually kind of, led me to start researching economics and financial interests. And then in 2012, our son was born, and so I started researching vaccines. And applying my journalism skills to that issue. And so, and now I'm mostly writing about the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's been kind of the main focuses over the years. Has shifted a lot. So I've written a lot of different topics, but for the most part,
I don't want to give myself a personal plug, but did you ever read that article that I did on Syria and about the revolution in Syria and the pipeline?
Yeah. Yes, I have read that. Yep.
Yeah, I published that in Politico, and that actually, I'm very proud of that article. But anyway, back to you. Let's talk. I'll tell the audience is what I really love about Jeremy is that I really rely on his judgment on a lot of the issues that are very complex. And, a lot of what we do in this movement is parsing through deliberate disinformation and also just the rumors that tend to permeate the movement all the time. I saw there was a meme that went out yesterday that said that Tony Fauci in 2008 had written an article about the 1918 flu epidemic, in which he had said that masks were the reason people during that epidemic, we now know that epidemic, were not dying of the flu. They were dying of bacterial meningitis. They were dying of a bacteria. And this meme that went through our movement said that Tony Fauci himself in 2008, he has acknowledged that, by the way, but that he, in addition to that, he said that a lot of people may have caught that bacterial meningitis from using masks. There were people in our movement who were retweeting that, and I had to send that out to our team and said, is this really true? And they went and read the article, and it was not true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That happens every day. And we're constantly, one of the things that one of the services that we are trying to provide the movement is to be able to take that disinformation and take the rumors and separate the chaff from the grain and really say, this is what you can say and this is what you can't.
Yeah.
And one of the people that I really rely on is Jeremy. And one of the challenges that I gave you early, I want to talk about masks, because that's what we're going to talk about a little today. And he's been doing a deep dive on masks. But the first big real assignment that I've given you, that I've constantly relied on you about, is to try to figure out when we hit the point where we can say this was a lab-generated virus that escaped from the Wuhan, four-level laboratory. And so every time somebody comes out with an article that says, yeah, now we know it's true, I send it to Jeremy. He always says, not yet, we don't have it yet. Tell us a little bit about that, about what do we know and what we don't know.
Yeah, that's such a deep discussion to have. I mean, there's so much information. And just to start out with, I think what people, the fundamental facts that people look at that are true, that lead people to this conclusion that it was a lab origin. For example, we know the NIH funded gain of function research, which is research to deliberately evolve pathogens to become more virulent and more able to infect human cells. So this is called gain of function research. So we know the NIH, Anthony Fauci's NIAID has funded this type of research. We know that includes funding to researchers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. And so that's all absolutely true. We know this. We also know that those researchers at Wuhan, I mean, they've spent years doing research, including gain of function research, looking specifically at coronaviruses since the SARS outbreak in 2003. They've been doing this type of research. And so, and also it's kind of a strange coincidence. People look at the fact that, where the outbreak happened in Wuhan, in the area of the wet market, that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is so nearby that location, and that's an odd coincidence. If it is a coincidence, it's a rather puzzling one. So there are all these kind of all these facts that we know of that do strongly suggest that is a very strong possibility that it escaped from this lab. So the question is then, well, when looking at the genome of the virus itself, is there evidence for that hypothesis? Which, by the way, the media just dismissed this as a conspiracy theory. That's one kind of extreme end of things. The media, well, anyone who suggests that it has a lab origin is a conspiracy theorist. No, that's not a conspiracy theory. That is a legitimate scientific hypothesis. If you attribute motives and things, then it goes into the realm of conspiracy theory. But what I'm mostly interested in is not motives or anything. I just want to know what are the facts and what does the genome sequence tell us. And of course, I don't know. I didn't study. My background isn't in virology or genetics or anything like this. So it's a very complicated subject to try to approach and tackle. But I have spoken to experts. For example, Richard Ebright, who is a longtime critic of gain of function research, and he's told me that he concurs that there's no direct evidence, there's no fingerprint or signature in the genome of the virus itself to show. There's no smoking gun, that shows that it was manipulated in the lab. However, we also know, contrary to what the authors of that Nature paper claimed and things, that they do have the means, the technology, and the know-how to be able to develop and evolve viruses in ways that don't leave a signature. So they can do it in ways where you can't tell the difference between the lab-engineered virus and a virus that evolves in nature. And we also know that they haven't identified the intermediary host. They claim that it must have jumped from bats to some intermediary host into humans. And they haven't identified that intermediary host yet. And so, they haven't proven their case. I mean, the people who are advocates of the hypothesis that it has a natural origin, that case is totally unproven, as is the case for lab origin. The truth is we just don't know at this point. The truth, as far as I can tell from my research into this topic. And that's where we're at. We still don't know. And of course, Richard Ebright has pointed out that to be able to be able to find out the truth about this would require an investigation. They had like a forensics investigation that, they'd have to go into the lab and get the records from the lab and the notebooks from the scientists and know what they were working on and do that type of investigation, which of course is highly unlikely to actually happen. And so my take is this: is that it doesn't really matter. I mean, obviously it matters, but we have a challenge. We have a problem that we're faced which is that regardless of its origin, we're faced with these extreme lockdown measures and this tendency, this move toward authoritarianism. And that is a serious threat. And of course, the lockdown measures, the end game of these measures, as explicitly stated by its advocates, is mass vaccination. And of course, implicitly, they can't achieve that goal without mandating an experimental COVID-19 vaccine. So that's the threat we're faced with. So the way I like to approach it is let's focus our energies on avoiding the controversy and just dealing with the hard, cold facts, because the politicians like to claim that their lockdown policies are based on science and supported by scientific evidence, and that's just totally untrue. And so I like to just focus my energies more on addressing the arguments for lockdowns and exposing the propaganda that we're constantly bombarded with, trying to manufacture our consent for these measures. in ways that really just deal with things that we know, what the science is very clear and uncontroversial about.
Yeah, I mean, that gets to kind of the essential question about this, and the conundrum, and the really surprising compliance of everybody. The media, which acts as kind of a fear-mongering cheerleader for these ideas, but the whole idea that Anthony Fauci, as a medical authority, represents scientific consensus. And I know, listen, I've been suing big polluters for 40 years, and every lawsuit that I have, there's somebody on the Monsanto side of the lawsuit, or the Exxon side, or whoever it is I'm suing, who's an expert, who's the world's expert, supposedly, from Stanford or Harvard School of Public Health. And they say one thing, and somebody else, then I bring my expert in, and they say something completely different. My wife came to the Monsanto trial when we were trying that, and we would examine their witness. They'd be utterly convincing. And then we'd bring on our own witness. And in every scientific controversy, there's two sides at least. And there's no such thing as a scientific consensus. And when you go to your doctor and he tells you you have cancer, if you're a thinking human being, you're going to say, I want to get a second opinion. Oh, there's always a second opinion out there. And how do we get to the point where we have one guy who's utterly compromised and corrupted by, for 50 years. And he now makes pronouncements. And by the way, they're not consistent pronouncements. At one point he says, maths work. And then he comes back without citing any science and say they don't work. He'll say hydroxychloroquine. He said he would take hydroxychloroquine. And later on, he says it doesn't work. We're not going to let anybody take it. And he says, he said, there's no transmission at aerosols. Aerosolized transmission doesn't occur. And later on, he says, it's the principal vector. It's weird that we've now anointed him as kind of this, this almost like a religious like figure who can make these pronouncements and change them by the day. And whatever he says, we're not allowed to even debate, and we censor anybody who differs with him. Isn't that to you the sort of frightening part of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually wrote an article specifically about that. The New York Times had an article, a hit piece on Dr. Scott Atlas, who of course is in the White House on the coronavirus task force. And so after he joined that team in the White House, the New York Times had a hit piece on him, explicitly arguing that we shouldn't listen to him because he's not an infectious disease expert like Anthony Fauci is. So in other words, we shouldn't listen to economists. We shouldn't listen to, health policy analysts like Dr. Scott Atlas. We shouldn't listen to, any other scientific field whatsoever. Only infectious disease experts and immunologists are the only scientific, only people with any kind of expertise, qualifying them to be able to comment and advise on public policy. This is absolutely insane. They're advocating policies that, they claim have benefits, which are debatable, and undebatably have harms. They have harms. This is known. It's not a question. There's no debate about that. There are negative consequences to these policies, and yet we're not supposed to take into consideration the views of economists, or anyone else. Are we not supposed to listen to the experts at the UN, who have put out numerous reports talking about the consequences in the developing world of these lockdown measures around the globe? Well over 100,000 excess infant mortality, hundreds of thousands of children suffering from wasting. This is excess harms, that wouldn't otherwise occur if it was, without these lockdown measures happening around the globe. Like, we're not supposed to listen to these people. I mean, these are experts too. They have a voice too. They have important things to say. And I personally think we should listen to all kinds of different perspectives and not try to like narrow our our attention to just like a handful of people like Dr. Anthony Fauci. I mean, it's totally ludicrous. It's absurd, and it's insane.
So let me ask you one other question, going back to the original, our original discussion about gain of function studies. Is there any evidence that it came from bats at the Wuhan market? Because I've also heard that there were no bats at the Wuhan market. What do you know about that? People.
Yeah.
What?
Thank you for bringing me back to that. I meant to mention that when I mentioned earlier that the outbreak occurred in the area of the Wuhan market, the wet market in Wuhan. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty certain that the outbreak did not actually start in the market. That might be where it kind of grew to a point where it became, a really massive outbreak and noticeable. But I mean, the very first cases had no connection to the wet market at all. And so scientists, I mean, there's pretty much agreement about that. I mean, that it didn't, the wet market wasn't the location of the, where it actually outbroke, where the outbreak actually originated. So that's pretty uncontroversial too, that we know that wasn't what happened. And so that, again, that adds to, which of course is what we were told originally, that was where it started. And it must have been animals, bats or some other, host intermediary animal at the wet market. And that's where it leapt from animals to humans. But we know that that's not true.
I just got one of the questions from one of our viewers who asked about Luc Montagnier. And Luc Montagnier, of course, is the Nobel laureate, the French scientist who first isolated HIV. And he has said definitively that this was an engineered virus. You don't agree with his analysis either, right? And Richard Ebright does not agree with that.
Well, I've seen the interview of him, the translated, I think it was, there was an interview that I forget which station it was, a French channel, I think. And he made that claim that, that there's HIV sequences inserted into the SARS-CoV-2 genome. Before he had made that claim, Indian researchers had made the same claim in a paper published on the preprint server, medRxiv. So preprint server is where papers are published that haven't yet been peer reviewed, but they're just published in preprint to just get the information out faster. And so these Indian researchers had kind of arrived at the same conclusion, or at least hinted at that. They didn't explicitly draw that conclusion, but it was very implicit in their argument that there are HIV inserts in the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The problem with that is that other scientists have pointed out that those specific sequences, two of which are pretty close match to HIV, but two of which aren't even that close a match, they're not unique to HIV. In fact, they're common motifs found in nature, and including in other common human coronaviruses. And so that led to the authors of that the Indian researchers withdrawing they retracted their article in response to these criticisms from other scientists, other experts in genetics and things, pointing out that that these are not unique to HIV. It's not that they took sequences from HIV and inserted it into SARS-CoV-2. It's just a coincidence that there's similarities. Yeah, but it's, again, according to these experts, that it's common motif found in nature. So that's as far as that argument goes. It's as far as I've seen. I have not yet seen a rebuttal to that counter argument.
All right. Well, we're going to stay tuned with Jeremy Hammond on the question of when we can actually claim that this came from the Wuhan lab. And I'm going to wait that on your verdict, Jeremy. Let's talk about masks. Everybody wants to hear about masks. Tell us what the bottom line is with masks.
The bottom line is that the executive mask wearing orders, the universal mask wearing orders, are unsupported by scientific evidence. That's the bottom line. There is and this discussion is very frustrating because it's so polarized. I mean, you have these two extremes. On one hand, you have the advocates of lockdown saying, everyone must wear a mask all the time. And on the other hand, you have people saying, well, masks are dangerous and they're harmful and nobody should ever wear masks. And the truth, of course, is somewhere in between, because there is a time and a place for mask use, and they can be ineffective in certain circumstances and used properly in the right type of mask. And there's all kinds of nuances. And that's one of the problems is most of the studies, number one, most of them don't involve SARS-CoV-2. For example, most of them relate to influenza research. Most of them relate to the healthcare setting, not the community setting. Most of them relate to N95 or surgical masks, not the cloth masks that people are being being told to wear. So there are all these different angles and aspects of, the issue that just are not being communicated to the public very well. You have people just saying, well, everyone should wear a mask all the time. And that we're being told that by politicians that this is what the science says. But I mean, even the World Health Organization, which usually I'm criticizing and find myself defending in some of my articles this past summer, for coming out and saying things like it's not airborne and these policies are unsupported by scientific evidence. Even the World Health Organization has pointed that out in its update. I believe it was early June 3rd, June 5th. It updated its guidance on masks based on a systematic review and meta-analysis that was published in The Lancet of all the available science on mask use, and they concluded that these universal policies are unsupported by the scientific evidence. I mean, that was it's right in their guidance.
Are you talking about Thomas Jefferson's study?
I'm talking about, the Lancet study cited Thomas Jefferson's.
Exactly. And Thomas Jefferson, just so that our viewers know, is one of the world's most respected scientists. He was the co-founder of the Cochrane Collaboration, which is a coalition of 30,000 scientists who have minimal financial involvement with the pharmaceutical industry. And it was created really as a backstop to monitor the integrity of pharmaceutical clinical trials and pharmaceutical science, which there's a consensus that the pharmaceutical industry now runs the scientific journals, journals like the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, the JAMA, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the biggest publisher of scientific journals in the world, which is Elsevier. They all are controlled by the pharmaceutical industry through advertising revenues and through reprint revenues, which represent, usually over 90% of their finances. And so Cochrane was founded by a group of independent scientists, very, very respected. Peter Gosha from Denmark and Thomas Jefferson from the UK were the principal co-founders. Thomas Jefferson is among one of the most respected scientists on the globe and most well-known. And he did a meta-review of the mask issues. And what a meta-review is, it's when somebody goes into the peer-reviewed scientific literature, which is all gathered in one archive, which is called PubMed, which is maintained by the National Institute of Health. And you can go in there and you can get every article that has ever been written on masks. And that's what a meta review is supposed to do. And it's supposed to get rid of the bad articles, focus on the good, the strong, the weighty articles, and then it's supposed to kind of produce or distill through that process some consensus conclusions about what the best science, published science at that time suggests. So both Thomas Jefferson did a meta review, and I don't know what year that was, but maybe you can tell us, Jeremy. And then the WHO did its own meta review in June, published in the Lancet, and they incorporated Thomas Jefferson's meta review. Is that a correct statement, kind of where we are?
Yeah. Just to clarify a little bit, so that was this year. Thomas Jefferson did a systematic review and meta-analysis. It was this year. It was published on a preprint server. I think it was also meta-archive that was published. So at the time the Lancet did its review, that Jefferson's meta-analysis had not been completed the peer review process and published in peer review literature. But they obviously Jefferson is a well-respected individual, and so they did cite his preprint. And that was in the Lancet article that was then used by the World Health Organization in order to update its mask guidance. And so yeah, and in Jefferson's review, I mean, he looked at, he did his own systematic review and analysis, and I mean, his conclusions were that that the evidence doesn't support the use of masks. In fact, and the thing that was unique about his is he was looking. I mean, he really emphasized randomized controlled trials, which of course are the gold standard in terms of scientific evidence, as opposed to observational studies. Yeah, and so it was very clear the results from the randomized controlled trials show really no evidence that masks are effective. And I'm talking about even like surgical masks, even in the healthcare setting. And whatever the reasons for that might be, whether because people don't wear the mask properly, whether because there might be whatever the reasons might be for that. That's what the evidence indicates. And so that was kind of the unique thing about Jefferson's study, which was then cited by the Lancet study, which did try to focus more on specifically on studies related to coronaviruses, so SARS and MERS and SARS-CoV-2. And they pointed out that there's kind of a dearth of studies specifically, about mask use with coronaviruses. Most of them, for example, the ones related to, I forget, I know all the ones related to like cloth masks. There's very few of those, but they all related to healthcare setting, and they also all the ones had to do with SARS. It had nothing to do with SARS-CoV-2. So there were no studies looking at this with SARS-CoV-2 at the time, and so. They did try to narrow it down to coronaviruses as opposed to what Jefferson did, looking at, like a lot of those studies, again, come from studies on influenza. But they did cite Jefferson's study in their meta-analysis.
And then is there any difference between the N95 masks and the cloth masks?
Well, that's the interesting thing. In the randomized controlled trials, according to Jefferson's analysis, actually they didn't show that N95 masks were more effective than surgical masks, which is interesting because the cloth masks, there was only one study I think that he talked about in his review that actually talked about cloth masks, but they weren't the type of cloth masks you buy off the shelf. They were actually considered personal protective equipment, PPE. I mean, they were used by healthcare workers, so it's a different type of cloth mask to begin with multiple layers and things. So that's the first point. And then they actually found that the cloth masks increased the risk compared to surgical masks, which was unusual. It was just interesting because they showed no effect of surgical masks. And then again, N95 masks don't appear to be better than surgical masks. So it's rather interesting what the randomized controlled trials show, and as opposed to, you have like these mechanistic studies or observational studies that people like to try to point to say, well, look, masks are effective. Everyone should wear masks. And of course, this conclusion, the universal policy, doesn't follow from even the findings that from the studies that do support mask use, that do show an effect, that do show a benefit. Of course, doesn't follow that everyone should wear them all the time. And of course, the World Health Organization pointed that out. If you're going out in public, it's totally unnecessary to wear masks if you can maintain social distancing. It makes sense if you're out in a place where there's crowds and you're going to be, there's going to be prolonged close contact. And the CDC defines close contact as within 6 feet of somebody for 10 minutes or more. So the idea that you're going to pass somebody in the grocery store aisle and get SARS-CoV-2 or spread it to them, I mean, this is totally ludicrous. I mean, this is not what the science is telling us about how the virus is transmitted. And the idea that you need to wear a mask in that situation is totally unsupported by the scientific evidence.
And then what about the idea that some masks might actually make you sick, that from breathing your own CO2, from reduced airflow, from also the toxics that are part of the mask, particularly the 3M masks. I was part of the litigation that is now the subject of the film Dark Waters, which is a Mark Ruffalo film where we sued DuPont for C8, which was, or PFOAs or PFOSs, which is a persistent toxic chemical that, was used in Teflon. And 3M is making the mask out of that same material, which is a known carcinogen. Um, what do we know about that? I can tell you from personal experience, I know teachers and school principals who are saying that children who wear masks are getting migraine headaches much more often. My wife, who wears a mask for work, she's in the entertainment industry, and part of the protocol she signs requires her to wear a mask when she's shooting a show, and that she was coming home every night getting sore throats at night and thinking maybe that she had COVID. And we were getting her tested all the time. And then she realized that it was actually the mask that was making her sick. And by the way, she goes to the kind of pro-mask, group. So she didn't have an ideological problem with wearing the mask. She was just getting sick from it. And I think she reluctantly, acknowledged that to me at some point. But tell me what your thoughts are on there, and what does that, to the extent that you've read the science, what are you seeing?
There's certainly harms from mask use, known and theoretical, that scientists have concerns about. I mean, the World Health Organization, again, to turn to an authoritative source, pointed that out in their guidance, that there's harms we also have to consider, and this is one of the things that that led to them to the conclusion that these universal mask wearing orders are not supported by the evidence, because it's not just the limited benefits from low quality scientific evidence that we have to consider, but also the harms, the potential harms from it. And they point to things like the possibility that, for example, if there is the one of the theoretical means by which it's transmitted is fomite transmission, so touching things and then touching your mouth or your nose and infecting yourself. So if fomite transmission is a substantial, significant mode of transmission, then you could potentially reinfect yourself. Touching something in the grocery store, and then you touch your face, because you touch your face more because you're always adjusting your mask, you're taking it off, you walk around the store, you see people just doing this all the time with their mask, adjusting it, moving it, and pulling it down. And so there, if that is a significant mode of transmission, then you can increase the risk of infecting yourself that way. That's one. With the, there's a lot of information about, the carbon dioxide and oxygen deprivation, excess carbon dioxide and oxygen deprivation. Those mostly, the studies on that mostly relate to N95 masks. There are some I've seen related more to surgical masks, but they were less clear in terms of with an N95 mask. There's no question that yes, when doctors wear them for extended periods of time, they're depriving themselves of oxygen, they're increasing their CO2 levels. And that has harmful effects. It causes headaches. It causes other issues, and inability to think clearly and things like this. It affects their brains. It might cause them to have tremors or other problems, which is concerning for surgeons and other healthcare professionals. But the thing is that does mostly relate to N95 masks. It's less of a concern, although obviously, there's common sense to be used here. You see pictures of children running in gym class outdoors wearing masks, and this is ridiculous. Obviously they're going to be depriving themselves of much needed oxygen in that state, in that circumstance, and it's just common sense not to wear a mask when you're running outdoors doing exercise. So there's issues like that. But then, basically there are potential harms. Just anecdotally myself, there was a time I remember we were in Costco, and the membership, they require you to wear a mask, and so I remember walking around, and after about 10 minutes of wearing the mask, I just started getting a headache, and so I just pulled it off because I just needed to breathe, and after 5 minutes my headache went away. And then, just to show respect to other people who were afraid of me because I didn't have my mask on. I put it back on after a while, and what do you know? Within 2 minutes, I had my headache come back, and it just, I just ended up taking it off because I didn't want to walk around the store with a headache, and without it, I didn't have a headache. So, yeah, these are known issues with the use of masks, and yeah, and especially when you get into the issue of school closures or school reopenings rather, and the requirement for children to wear masks. And number one, children don't know how. Most adults don't know how to wear masks properly, and we expect kids to be able to do it. This is craziness. And I know how to wear a mask properly, but I don't, because when I do wear one, because it's absurd for me to be even wearing a mask. I only wear them out of respect for property rights. When I'm asked to wear one by the staff of the store or whatever. Certainly not out of obedience to the Governor Whitmer's orders, which, by the way, were stricken down by the Supreme Court.
And by the way, I'm talking to Jeremy Hammond, and Jeremy writes often for the Children's Health Defense. Our new journal, which we launched today, is called The Defender, and we hope you will all subscribe to The Defender as quickly as you can, where it's uncensored, nonpartisan. All of that material that you see censored on all of the other platforms, social media, we're going to put in our journal, The Defender, and we're going to have a lively, robust, open debate. You have to be civil. We encourage you to be nonpartisan, but if you have something to say, we want to hear it. And Jeremy, where can people find you other than The Defender?
JeremyRHammond.com. I use my middle initial there, JeremyRHammond.com. And if you go to JeremyRHammond.com/FDA, you can sign up for my newsletter and also download my report, 5 Horrifying Facts About the FDA Vaccine Approval Process, which is got a lot of relevant information for what's happening right now with these COVID-19 vaccines under development and being fast-tracked under Operation Warp Speed.
Yeah, fast-tracked, including not tested, really, except... the Peter Doshi article this week in the BMJ was pretty incredible, where he broke down the testing and said, the testing is not designed to show whether the vaccine protects you against transmissibility or hospitalization or death.
Right.
It's only designed to show whether or not it will prevent mild symptoms, make symptoms more mild. That's it. And what's the point of a vaccine if that's all it does? But as the title of his article is designed to succeed. In other words, the testing is designed to make them look like they actually are going to do some good, and it's a pretty frightening article. One other subject that I want to ask you about masks, which is the one that intrigues me the most, is the impact on social and political interactions in our society. I was walking this morning, and I had many people. I was walking without a mask in downtown LA, and I had many people come and cross the street so that they could avoid me. And it really, it struck me as, your facial expressions are the way that we communicate to each other. And it's critical in politics, it's critical in social interactions. It's a critical part of our community. And if you look through the history of totalitarian states, one of the first things they do is to crush every feature of self-expression that, Hitler, when he went into Romania, I was reading actually the Gestapo instructions from Hitler, in which he literally says, kill all the poets, kill all the artists, kill all the intellectuals, kill all the university professors, kill anybody, immediately liquidate all people who might be able to, do self-expression. And the ultimate, the ultimate vector for self-expression is your facial features. And that's why they're, really totalitarian theocracies who want to treat women as chattels and comply total obedience will require facial coverings for them or burqas or whatever because it denies their humanity. And so what does it do to us when the government is telling us you got to wear a mask? And is that a cost that, public health officials ought to measure when they make, when they compel us to do things? Our civil rights.
Well, that's a really good, important point. That that's another issue that we need to also take into consideration. It's not just supposed benefits and harms, whether known or theoretical, but also there's questions of liberty here. There's questions of fundamental human rights, and that's really the point of the executive mask wearing orders. It's not about what the science says. It's not about reducing transmission of SARS-CoV-2. It's about obedience. It's about getting us all just to kind of fall in line and trust our overlords and obey our overlords and who are somehow omniscient enough to be able to decide for every single individual like how that individual ought to be behaving, regardless of the individual's personal unique circumstances. I mean, this is insane, but that's the effect of it, and it really is. You mentioned at the beginning of our discussion here, the kind of how frightening and mind-blowing it is how people have just been so submissive through all of this and just kind of just willing to surrender their rights. And not just that, but it's the film The Matrix is such a good allegory. It's like they want to actually fight to keep the system of enslavement. They're willing to not just be passive about it, but like to fight to keep that system and to fight in favor of these things. And it's just because they're so afraid. People are so afraid. And of course, the media play into that. They play into the fear, and there's so much fear mongering from the politicians and the media, and that's what they depend on. And so, we really need to focus on addressing people's fears and calming people's fears, and trying to get people to take kind of a more rational, data-driven, scientific, calm approach to this, and to look at the data and not just listen to what politicians say the science says, but to look at the science and see what it says. And so, that's my take on these mask orders. Is it's really about obedience and just trying to get to teach us compliance. And then, of course, which is looking more long term in kind of the bigger context of that. Their solution, the solution for the end game, the exit strategy of these lockdown measures is explicitly mass vaccination. So they're training us all to just be obedient little serfs. And then, of course, eventually, it's not just the masks. Eventually, they're going to want us to accept whatever, vaccine, when it gets to market. We're supposed to just shut up and go get our shots, just like we're supposed to do with the flu vaccine or any other vaccine recommended by the CDC. And so that's kind of what's on the horizon. That's what's coming. And so, I think there's a place for, I'm not going to not wear a mask, just because, I'm not willing to submit. If I'm in a circumstance where I feel that it would be respectful, or there was some potentially, if I'm in a situation where there is prolonged close contact with others, I'm going to just, out of respect to people and to calm their fears and things, I'll put a mask on. It's no big deal. But but at the same time, there's a place for civil disobedience. And here, I never wore a mask at the grocery store until I was threatened with punishment for it. And then the governor here made the stores, actually the law enforcement, she deputized them basically by threatening their licenses and threatening them with fines and things if they didn't enforce her executive order. And so the stores, they won't let you in. They'll say, you need to wear a mask to come into the stores. And so, but I think we need to keep that bigger context in mind. And the fact that, that the lockdown advocates not only are not considering the economic harms, and which, by the way, we must look at in terms of not just dollars, but health and lives. Again, looking at the UN estimates of the impact on health and lives in the developing world. They're not willing to look at the economic consequences, and they're not looking to consider the consequences in terms of our freedom and our liberty. And this is Peter Goethe pointed this out in an article months ago, how this is like a dream for authoritarians around the world, because they can just do the same thing Western governments are doing and supposedly democratic governments are doing, and to increase their control over people and their authoritarian policies. And they can get away with it, and because they're just doing what democracies are doing, And so that really is a huge risk. I mean, that's something to consider is how these policies, how they can be used as pretext for really, really authoritarian measures. And there's a really grave threat right now to our health and our freedom, and it's a real big challenge. It's a real big battle. It's an information war, and we really need to win this war. And that is why it is so important to really get things straight. And and really, as news consumers, we really need to be careful and not spread misinformation, because it's counterproductive if we do share information that can be debunked. And because the lockdown advocates, of course, like to point and say, well, anyone who disagrees with these policies, they're a bunch of conspiracy theorists spreading misinformation. We shouldn't legitimize that criticism. So we really do need to be careful. And it's challenging. It is a challenge to be able to kind of, what is the truth? How do we know what to believe? But thankfully, there are sources like Children's Health Defense and the Defender out there. And I try to do this with my work and should try to give people clarity about, what it is that we do know and what it is that we don't know, and what's true and what's not. And it is a challenge. And this is why it takes untold hours of research to be able to try to figure these things out, which most people don't have that kind of time. So I understand that. But we have to do our best.
Jeremy Hammond, thank you so much. Thank you for your work, and thank you for joining me today. And I hope you'll come back and talk again. We got a lot of you're very, very popular among our listeners and commenters. I want to just answer that this smoothie was one of R Hammond's smoothies. I got it out of his book, The 10-Day Sugar Detox Diet. So I want to give him a plug. And Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. And, please keep up the good work. Keep informing us. And I will continue to look at you as a source of reliable information and thoughtful, and, your integrity and your research acumen is so valuable to all of us in Children's Health Defense. Thank you very much. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you. It's an honor.